In the spring of 1887, long before anyone thought to question what lay beneath the Hartwell Farmhouse, the land itself seemed to exist in a quiet state of watchfulness. The property stretched across 80 acres of rolling farmland in rural Pennsylvania, near the uncertain line where Lancaster County gave way to Lebanon. It was not a dramatic landscape. There were no cliffs or rivers wide enough to command attention. Instead, the land moved in slow, patient rises and dips, like something breathing beneath the surface. Fields of winter wheat, just beginning to recover from the cold, spread outward in muted shades of green. The soil was dark and heavy, turned over year after year by the same rhythms: planting, tending, harvesting, and waiting. To the west, a narrow band of forest stood like a boundary that had never been fully agreed upon. The trees grew close together there, their branches weaving into one another, casting shadows that seemed deeper than they should have been. In the early mornings, before the sun had fully risen, a thin mist would settle low across the fields, clinging to the ground as if reluctant to leave. It softened the edges of everything, the fences, the distant tree line, even the farmhouse itself, until the entire property seemed suspended in a kind of quiet uncertainty. It was a place shaped by routine, a place where days were measured not by clocks but by light. And at the center of it all stood the Hartwell house. It had been built in 1823 by Nathaniel Hartwell, a man whose name appeared often enough in county records to suggest both success and caution. He had purchased the land from a family named Clean, who had abandoned it abruptly just 2 years earlier after a fire destroyed their original home. No one in the area ever spoke much about that fire. It was acknowledged but rarely discussed, as though it belonged to a chapter better left closed. Nathaniel built his house with intention. The foundation was laid in stone, thick blocks of limestone hauled from nearby quarries and fitted together with a precision that spoke of patience rather than haste. The masons who worked the site had taken their time, setting each stone carefully, ensuring that the weight of the structure would settle evenly and hold for generations. Above that foundation rose a timber frame built from oak and chestnut trees cut directly from the land itself. The wood had been aged before use, a practice already fading by the 1820s, but one Nathaniel insisted upon. Fresh timber, he believed, carried too much uncertainty. Wood needed time to settle, to dry, to become predictable. Only then could it be trusted. The house that emerged was not extravagant, but it was deliberate. Every beam, every joint, every board had been placed with the expectation that it would endure. And endure it did. By 1887, the house had stood for more than 60 years. It had passed from Nathaniel to his son, and then to his grandson, Thomas Hartwell, who now occupied it with the same quiet steadiness that seemed to define everything about the property. From the outside, the house appeared welcoming in a restrained, practical way. The wraparound porch offered shade in the summer and shelter in the winter. The windows were large enough to allow in light, but small enough to retain warmth. The paint, a soft, weathered white, had been maintained carefully, though time had begun to show through in faint cracks and uneven tones. But there was something else about the house, something harder to name. Visitors sometimes remarked, though never directly, that the house felt watchful. Not in a way that suggested danger, but in a way that suggested memory, as though the walls had absorbed more than just the passing of time. Inside, the house followed a familiar pattern. The kitchen was the heart of it, a large open space where most of the day's work and conversation took place. A cast-iron stove, installed some years earlier, stood near the center, radiating a steady warmth. The wooden floors, original to the house, had been worn smooth by decades of footsteps. They creaked in certain places, though never unpredictably. Even their sounds had become part of the routine. Beyond the kitchen was a small parlor, reserved for guests and for the rare occasions when formality was required. The furniture there was well kept but seldom used, as though it belonged more to expectation than necessity. Upstairs were the bedrooms, simple, functional, and arranged with the same quiet order that defined the rest of the house. And beneath it all, accessible through a trapdoor in the kitchen floor, lay the cellar. Cool, dim, and practical. A place for storage. A place for things meant to be kept. By all appearances, the Hartwell house was exactly what it was meant to be. A generational home built on stability, maintained through discipline, and passed down without disruption. But stability, as it turns out, can sometimes conceal more than it reveals. Thomas Hartwell was 63 years old in the spring of 1887. He was a man shaped by routine and restraint, the kind of person who believed that order was not something to be pursued, but something to be maintained. His days followed a pattern so consistent that it rarely needed to be spoken aloud. He rose before sunrise, attended to the livestock, walked the boundaries of the property, and kept detailed records of everything from crop yields to feed consumption. His handwriting, neat and deliberate, filled ledger after ledger, numbers, dates, observations. There was comfort in that kind of record-keeping, a sense that as long as things were written down, they could not entirely slip away. Thomas attended church every Sunday without fail. He spoke when spoken to, listened more than he talked, and carried himself with a quiet authority that did not invite challenge. He had not always lived alone. His first wife had died in 1856, leaving him with 2 young sons, William and Robert. For a time, the house had been louder, less orderly, filled with the unpredictable rhythms of children growing into men. But that time had passed. Thomas remarried 2 years later, a decision that in many ways reshaped everything that followed. His sons never accepted it. William, the older of the 2, left for Ohio in 1860, taking a position as a clerk in a mercantile business in Columbus. Robert followed 3 years later, drawn by the promise of industrial work and the distance it offered from home. Neither returned for more than brief visits. Letters were exchanged, though not often, and over time even those became infrequent. The house, once divided by quiet tensions, became quieter still. When Thomas married Catherine, he brought into the home a presence that did not quite settle into its rhythms. Catherine Hartwell was, in many ways, a contrast to everything the house represented. She was younger than Thomas by nearly 20 years, educated, well-read, and raised in Philadelphia among merchants and professionals rather than farmers. Her speech carried a softness shaped by the city, her manner deliberate in a way that suggested thought rather than habit. Where Thomas moved through the world with certainty, Catherine seemed to move through it with awareness. She noticed things, small things. The way light shifted across a room at different times of day, the way the wind moved through the trees before a change in weather, the way people spoke, not just what they said, but how they chose to say it. She kept a journal, writing in it often, sometimes for hours at a time. She would take it with her on her walks across the property, sitting beneath the old oak trees and recording thoughts that no one else would ever read. The neighbors did not dislike her, but they did not understand her either. She was polite, composed, and never openly unfriendly, but there was a distance to her, a sense that even when she was present, part of her attention was elsewhere. It was not uncommon to see her walking alone in the early mornings, long before the rest of the household had begun its day. She moved quietly across the fields, her journal tucked beneath her arm, pausing now and then, as if listening for something that others could not hear. Some said she was simply thoughtful. Others said she was restless. A few, speaking only in private, suggested that she carried something with her, something unresolved. There were small habits that drew attention. She preferred certain rooms over others. She avoided the cellar unless it was absolutely necessary. And there were moments, brief, easily missed, when her composure seemed to falter. A hesitation before entering the kitchen. A glance toward the floor, quickly dismissed. A tightening of her expression when certain topics were mentioned. Nothing obvious, nothing that could be named directly, but enough to leave an impression. Thomas did not speak of these things. If he noticed them, he gave no indication. Their marriage, from the outside, appeared stable. They worked together, managed the property, attended church side by side. There were no public disagreements, no signs of discord that would invite speculation, but there was a space between them. Not distance exactly, something quieter than that. A kind of understanding built not on what was shared, but on what was left unspoken. By the spring of 1887, the Hartwell house had settled into a rhythm that felt, to anyone observing from the outside, complete. The land was productive, the house was maintained, the routines were intact. And yet, there was something beneath it all, not visible, not acknowledged, but present. Like a second layer beneath the surface of things, waiting. And if you've been listening this far, if you find yourself drawn into stories like this, the quiet ones, the ones that take their time, the ones that uncover history piece by piece, then you're exactly the kind of listener this channel was built for. There's a link in the description where you can support the work. Buy a cup of coffee. Help me keep digging, keep writing, keep bringing these stories to life. Because stories like this don't just appear. They're found, and sometimes they're hidden for a reason. By late April of 1887, the first real warmth of spring had begun to settle across the Hartwell property. The snow that had lingered stubbornly through March was finally gone, replaced by soft ground that gave slightly underfoot. The fields, still damp from the thaw, carried the scent of turned earth and melting frost. Water ran in thin, quiet streams along the edges of the property, slipping into the soil as if it had always belonged there. But with the thaw came something else, a slow, creeping dampness that found its way into places it did not belong. It began in the kitchen. At first, it was nothing more than a faint irregularity, a slight warping in a section of the floor near the eastern wall. The boards, worn smooth by decades of use, had always carried small imperfections, a creak here, a shift there. These were expected, familiar. But this was different. The wood had begun to lift, just enough to notice, just enough to feel beneath the weight of a step. And there was a smell, subtle at first, then harder to ignore. A faint, earthy dampness that lingered in the air, even after the windows had been opened and the morning breeze had passed through. Thomas Hartwell noticed it the way he noticed most things, without comment at first. He stepped across the affected boards one morning, paused slightly, and shifted his weight as if testing something that had not yet fully revealed itself. Later that same day, he knelt beside the area, pressing his hand against the wood, feeling for softness. There was no urgency in his movements, only certainty. By the following week, the decision had been made. The boards would need to be replaced. There was no sense in delaying it. Rot, once it began, rarely stopped on its own. And so, as he had done many times before, Thomas sent word into town. The man he called was Henry Voss. Voss was known throughout the county as a careful craftsman, steady, deliberate, and not given to unnecessary conversation. He was in his early 40s, with the kind of posture that came from years of working with his hands. His reputation had been built slowly, over time, through work that lasted. He arrived at the Hartwell Farmhouse on a Tuesday morning. With him was his apprentice, a young man named William Clean, 17 years old, quick-eyed, eager, and, as it would later become clear, not yet practiced in the discipline of silence. The wagon carrying their tools came to a slow stop near the side of the house. The sound of iron-rimmed wheels against the packed earth echoed briefly before settling into stillness. Catherine Hartwell was already waiting on the porch. She had been watching the road. For how long, it was difficult to say. She greeted them politely, her voice steady, her posture composed. There was nothing outwardly unusual in her manner, no hesitation, no visible concern. And yet, there was something in the way her eyes moved, not toward the men, but past them, toward the house, as if measuring something, as if preparing. Thomas was not there. He had left early that morning to tend to a sick animal in the far pasture, leaving the work to proceed without him. It was not unusual. The farm did not pause for repairs. Voss and his apprentice carried their tools inside, their boots leaving faint impressions on the worn kitchen floor. The morning light streamed in through the eastern windows, falling directly across the section of warped boards. Voss knelt immediately. He ran his hand along the wood, pressing lightly, then more firmly. The boards gave slightly under pressure. He nodded once. "That'll need replacing," he said, almost to himself. Catherine stood near the doorway, watching. There was a brief pause, and then quietly she spoke. "Is there no way to repair them without removing them entirely?" The question was reasonable, expected even. But there was something in the way she asked it, not casual, not practical. Careful. Measured. Voss shook his head. "No, ma'am. Once it's gone soft like this, it won't hold. Best to take it up and see what's underneath." A moment passed, longer than necessary. Catherine's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the doorframe. "Underneath," she repeated. The word seemed to linger. Then she nodded. "Of course." The work began. The sound of metal against wood broke the quiet rhythm of the house. Voss worked with practiced precision, sliding the edge of a pry bar beneath the first board, applying steady pressure until the nails gave with a dull, resistant pull. The board lifted. A hollow space revealed beneath. Nothing unusual. Not yet. The apprentice moved closer, watching carefully, mimicking each movement in his mind before attempting it himself. Together they worked methodically, removing one board at a time. The air changed as they worked. Cooler, damp, carrying a faint scent that did not belong to the open cellar below. This was something else, something contained. Catherine did not leave. She remained near the doorway, her presence quiet but constant. At times she would step away, only to return moments later, as if she could not fully remove herself from the room. Her gaze followed each movement, each lifted board, each exposed gap. "Perhaps," she said at one point, her voice softer now, "perhaps only the damaged boards need to be removed." Voss did not look up. "It's best to check the full section," he replied. "Rot spreads." Another board came loose, then another, and then something changed. The sound, the resistance. The space beneath the boards did not open into the expected joists and foundation. Instead, there was wood. A second surface, set below the first, darker, older, and placed with intention. Voss stopped. He leaned forward, brushing away dust and debris with the back of his hand. The grain of the lower boards was different, tighter, more worn, marked by age in a way that suggested they had not simply been left there. They had been covered. deliberately. "Ma'am," Voss said slowly, "did you know there's another layer under here?" Silence. He turned slightly. Catherine had stepped closer. Her face had lost its color, not gradually, not subtly, but all at once. Her hand gripped the edge of the doorway again, more firmly now, as though the strength in her legs had momentarily failed her. For a brief second it seemed as though she might speak, but she didn't. Instead she turned, and without a word, she left the room. The sound of her footsteps moved quickly across the hall, then up the stairs. A door closed, and then a lock. The sound was clear, final. The apprentice looked up. "What was that about?" he asked quietly. Voss didn't answer. He was still staring at the exposed space beneath the floor, at the second layer, at the space between them. It was narrow, perhaps 8 inches. Not enough for anything large, but enough. More than enough. "Hold the light closer," Voss said. The apprentice obeyed. The dim space beneath the boards came into clearer view. Dust, debris, and something else. Something wrapped, tucked carefully between the joists. William Cleany reached for it before he fully thought it through. Youth often moves faster than caution. His hand disappeared into the gap. For a moment there was resistance, then he pulled something free. It was a bundle, wrapped in oilcloth. The fabric had yellowed with age, stiff at the folds, tied with twine that had darkened and hardened over time. It had been placed there carefully, not dropped, not forgotten. Hidden. Voss took it from him, carefully, as though it might break, or reveal something simply by being touched. The room had grown quieter. The outside sounds, the wind, the distant movement of animals, the creak of the porch, seemed to fade. There was only the bundle, and the space it had come from. Voss began to unwrap it, slowly, layer by layer. The oilcloth crackled faintly as it opened. Inside, paper, dozens of sheets, folded, stacked, preserved. He lifted the top page. The ink had faded, but it was still legible. Neat handwriting, deliberate, controlled. He read. At first, his expression did not change. But as his eyes moved across the page, something shifted. Subtle, then unmistakable. His jaw tightened, his brow lowered. He read further, another page, then another. The apprentice leaned closer. "What is it?" he asked. Voss did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. "We need to stop." He folded the papers carefully, rewrapped them, held the bundle in both hands. "We need to tell Mr. Hartwell." He stood, and that was when Catherine returned. She did not rush. She descended the stairs slowly, one step at a time, composed, controlled, but changed. Her eyes were red, her hands unsteady, though she tried to hide it. She reached the bottom step and stepped into the kitchen. Her gaze went directly to the bundle in Voss's hands. She did not ask what it was. She already knew. "Those documents," she said, her voice steady now, almost cold, "are private property." Silence. "They belong to this household," she continued, "and I must insist that you return them." Voss did not move. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "if these contain evidence of something unlawful—"
"They do not!"
The interruption was immediate, sharp.
"There is no wrongdoing here, only matters that do not concern anyone outside this home."
The apprentice shifted uncomfortably. The tension in the room had become something tangible, heavy, difficult to ignore. You were hired to repair the floor, Catherine said. That work is complete. You will be paid, and I expect your discretion. Voss looked at her, really looked at her, not as a client, but as someone carrying something far heavier than she could conceal. He hesitated, then asked quietly, "Is anyone in danger?" The question settled into the room. For a moment, Catherine did not respond. She stood very still, her gaze lowered slightly, as though searching for an answer she had already considered many times before. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed, softer now, tired. "No," she said. A pause, then, "No one is in danger." She lifted her eyes again and added, almost as if the words had to be said to make them true, "Not anymore." Thomas Hartwell returned to the house later than usual that afternoon. The sun had already begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the eastern fields. His boots were heavy with mud, his shirt darkened with the work of the day. There was nothing outwardly different about his routine, nothing to suggest that anything had changed. And yet, there was something in the way the house greeted him. Not silence. The house was always quiet. But this was something else. A stillness that felt aware. He stepped inside through the kitchen door, removing his hat and placing it in its usual spot. His eyes moved across the room with the practiced habit of someone who noticed small changes without needing to be told. The floor. The boards near the eastern wall had been lifted. The tools were still there, and Henry Voss was waiting. That alone was enough to tell him that something had gone beyond simple repair. "Mr. Hartwell," Voss said, his tone respectful but measured. "There's something you need to see." Thomas did not respond immediately. He set his gloves down, then walked forward, each step deliberate, unhurried. Voss handed him the bundle, wrapped again, carefully, as though returning something that had never truly belonged in his hands. Thomas took it. There was no visible reaction at first, no surprise, no confusion. Only recognition. A quiet, inward kind of recognition that settled into his expression without needing explanation. He sat down at the kitchen table without removing his boots. That, more than anything, marked the moment as different. Thomas Hartwell did not break routine. But now, he unfolded the oilcloth, slowly. The same careful layers, the same preserved pages, the same handwriting. He began to read. The room remained still. Voss stood near the window. The apprentice hovered near the doorway, uncertain whether to stay or leave. And Catherine? Catherine stood just beyond the threshold, half in shadow, watching. Thomas read without interruption, page after page. His eyes moved steadily, but his hands betrayed him. A slight tremor, barely noticeable, but there. At one point he stopped, closed his eyes. Not for long, just enough. Then continued. When he finished, he did not look up immediately. He folded the papers again, rewrapped them, placed the bundle on the table. Then finally, he spoke. "You found this beneath the floor." It was not a question. Voss nodded. "Yes, sir." Another pause. "And no one else has seen it?" The apprentice shifted, just slightly, but Thomas noticed. His gaze moved to him briefly, then back to Voss. "No one outside this room," Voss said. That was not entirely true, but it was close enough. Thomas leaned back in his chair. For a moment, he said nothing. The weight of the silence settled over the room like something physical. Then, "I will pay you double your rate," he said quietly. The words were direct, practical. but they carried something beneath them, an understanding. "The work will be completed," Thomas continued. "The floor will be restored, and what was found here will not be spoken of again." Voss hesitated, not out of greed, but out of principle. "You understand what's in those papers?" he asked. Thomas met his gaze. "I do. And you're certain I am?" The firmness in his voice ended the question before it could fully form. Voss nodded slowly. He had seen enough in Thomas's face to understand that whatever lay within those documents was not new to him. Not entirely. The agreement was made without further discussion. The bundle was returned to Catherine, and the work resumed. Over the next 2 days, the kitchen floor was restored. New boards were cut and fitted with precision, sanded and finished to match the old. The craftsmanship was careful, almost reverent, as though the act of sealing the space carried more significance than the repair itself. The second layer remained. The space between them closed again, and when the final board was set in place, there was no visible trace of what had been uncovered. The house returned to its appearance of normalcy. But something had shifted. Not in the structure, in the silence. Because secrets, once disturbed, do not settle easily, and some are not meant to stay contained. William Clean was 17 years old. He had been apprenticed to Henry Voss for just over a year, long enough to understand the basics of the trade, but not long enough to understand the weight of discretion. At first he said nothing, for a day, then 2, but the memory of what he had seen did not fade. It sharpened. The bundle, the papers, Catherine's face, Thomas's reaction, the way the room had changed. It pressed on him, demanded to be spoken. And so, he told his mother. Quietly, late in the evening, framed as something strange, something unusual, not meant to cause harm, just something he needed to share. But secrets do not remain as they are when passed from one person to another. They grow, they shift, they gather shape. His mother told her sister told a neighbor. The neighbor told someone at church, and within a week, the story had begun to move. By the end of the month, it had taken on a life of its own. The details were inconsistent, contradictory, but the core remained. Something had been found beneath the Hartwell farmhouse, something hidden, something important enough to be concealed. The rumors spread through the county the way such things always do, quietly at first, then with increasing certainty. Some said it was money, gold coins hidden during the war. Others said it was evidence of wrongdoing, documents that could ruin the family. A few whispered darker things. Things no one said out loud in full but implied. The Hartwell name, once associated with steadiness and routine, began to carry something else. Curiosity, speculation, and in some corners, suspicion. Thomas and Catherine did not respond. They continued as they always had. Church on Sunday, work during the week, polite interactions with neighbors. But those who paid attention noticed the difference. Conversations shortened. Glances lingered. Questions remained unasked, but not unfelt. Catherine, in particular, withdrew further. Her morning walks became longer. Her journal filled more quickly. And there were moments, brief, fleeting, when her composure seemed thinner than before, as if something within her had been unsettled, not broken, but disturbed. The situation might have remained contained within rumor, might have faded with time, but the community had its own mechanisms. and one of them was the church. Reverend Samuel Pritchard had served the area for nearly 20 years. He was not a man prone to gossip, but he understood its power and its consequences. When enough whispers reached him, consistent enough, persistent enough, he made a decision. He would speak with Thomas directly, not as an investigator, but as a shepherd. He arrived at the Hartwell Farmhouse on a quiet afternoon. The visit was received with courtesy, expected even. Thomas welcomed him into the study, closed the door, and listened. The Reverend spoke carefully, without accusation, without assumption, but clearly. He had heard concerns, uncertainty, questions, and he felt it was his responsibility to understand whether there was any truth behind them. Thomas did not deflect. He did not deny, but he did not reveal everything either. "There were documents found," he said, his voice steady, measured. "Old records belonging to my father." The Reverend nodded. "And their nature?" Thomas paused, just briefly. "Matters relating to the Civil War." The answer was true, but incomplete. "They are being handled appropriately," Thomas added. "There is no danger, no wrongdoing on my part." The Reverend studied him. There was honesty in Thomas's words, but also restraint, a boundary. He did not press further. Some truths, he understood, were not given freely. When he left, he felt reassured, but not entirely at ease, because there are moments when a man tells the truth and still withholds something that matters. Summer came, the fields grew fuller, the routines continued, and for a time the tension seemed to settle into something manageable. Until the arrival of a man who had not heard the rumors, but knew exactly what he was looking for. His name was Edward Vance. He came from Philadelphia, unannounced, uninvited, and when he stepped onto the Hartwell property, he carried with him something far more dangerous than rumor. He carried certainty. Catherine saw him first, standing at the edge of the porch, hat in hand, composed, waiting. For a brief moment, she did not move. Her expression shifted, not into fear, but recognition. Deep, immediate, and unwelcome. When she finally stepped forward to greet him, her voice was steady, but something beneath it had changed. "You weren't expected," she said. "No," Vance replied, "but I believe I was anticipated." That was the moment everything shifted, because whatever had been hidden beneath those floorboards, whatever had been contained within those documents, it had not remained buried, not entirely. And now, it had come looking for them. The letter arrived in the winter of 1888. It came without urgency, carried in the ordinary way such things were carried, folded, sealed, and delivered among other pieces of correspondence that bore no particular weight at first glance. But the name on it changed everything. Samuel Hartwell. Thomas recognized the handwriting immediately. There was no mistaking it. Even after all the years, even after the distance that had settled between them, his brother's hand remained the same, firm, deliberate, and slightly angled, as though each word had been considered before it was allowed to exist. Thomas did not open it right away. He turned it over once in his hands, studying the seal, the faint impressions left by pressure and time. Letters between them had been infrequent in recent years, not hostile, not estranged, but distant in a way that felt final even when it wasn't. This one felt different, not because of what it said, but because of when it had been sent. Samuel was dead. The news had arrived days earlier, brief, formal, and without detail. A passing noted in a single paragraph. Pneumonia they had said. Complications. Quick, but not unexpected. Thomas had read that notice in silence, and now, this. A letter written before death meant to arrive after it. There is a particular weight to such things, a sense that whatever is written inside has already crossed a boundary, that it belongs not to the living, but to something just beyond them. Thomas opened it that evening. The house was quiet. Catherine sat across the room, her journal closed in her lap, watching without appearing to watch. The fire in the stove burned low, casting a steady, flickering light that shifted gently across the walls. Thomas unfolded the letter and began to read. At first, his expression did not change. But Catherine noticed the stillness, the way his eyes slowed, the way his breathing adjusted almost imperceptibly. The letter was not long, but it was precise. Samuel had always been that way. He wrote of the past, not in detail, but with reference, enough to confirm what had already been suspected but not yet spoken. He wrote of their father, of the years following the Civil War, of decisions made and decisions avoided. And then he wrote of the space beneath the floor, not directly, but clearly enough. He knew. He had always known. The documents hidden there had not been forgotten. They had been preserved, deliberately, by their father and by silence. Samuel wrote that he had carried that knowledge for years, that he had chosen not to speak of it, not out of indifference, but out of respect, or perhaps out of fear of what speaking it might require. But now, with death approaching, he could not leave it unresolved. "You will find them," he had written, or perhaps you already have. There was no comfort in the words, only inevitability. "What is written there will not remain hidden forever," Samuel continued, "and when it comes to light, you must decide what is to be done with it, not as a son, but as a man who understands the weight of consequence." Thomas read the final lines more than once, then folded the letter again, carefully, as though returning it to a place it had already left. Catherine spoke first. "What does he say?" Thomas did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter than usual. He knew. That was all, but it was enough, because now there was no longer any question, only decision. Edward Vance returned to the farmhouse within the week. This time he was expected, summoned. There was no pretense of coincidence now, no suggestion of distant relation as the sole purpose of his visit. Whatever connection existed between him and Catherine's past had already been acknowledged. This visit was about something else, something far more immediate. The documents were brought out again, unwrapped, spread across the table in the study. For the first time since their discovery, they were examined fully, not as a hidden burden, but as a record. Vance read them slowly, page by page, occasionally pausing to make notes, occasionally asking a question, but mostly reading. The room remained quiet. Thomas sat opposite him, still, watching. Catherine stood near the window, her gaze turned outward, though her attention remained fixed on every word that passed between them. Hours passed, then days, because what lay within those documents was not simple. It was not a single story. It was many, interwoven, fragmented, and incomplete. At first, the pattern seemed clear. Names, dates, locations, movements, records of individuals who had passed through the Hartwell property during the years of the Civil War. Men, women, children, escaped from slavery, seeking passage north toward freedom. The Underground Railroad. That much was unmistakable. Samuel Hartwell Sr., Thomas's father, had been involved, actively, deliberately. He had provided shelter, food, clothing, guidance. He had been, by all appearances, exactly what history would later call a conductor, a man who helped others move through a system designed to evade capture and defy law. There were letters included, some written by those he had helped, gratitude expressed in careful, sometimes uneven handwriting, accounts of new lives begun in northern states, in Canada. Freedom, described not as a moment but as a process, fragile, uncertain, but real. These letters carried weight, human weight. Lives changed, families preserved, hope documented. But then, the pattern shifted, because alongside those letters were others, different in tone, different in outcome, letters that spoke of failure, of capture, of disappearance. And then there were the ledgers, carefully kept, structured, precise, containing entries that did not read like stories, but like accounts. Notations beside names, symbols, marks, some explained, some not. Vance studied these carefully, cross-referencing, comparing, looking for consistency, and finding it. But not in the way one might hope. "There are gaps," he said at one point. Thomas did not respond. Vance tapped a line on the page. This individual recorded as having passed through here in 1863. No follow-up, no confirmation of arrival. He moved to another. And here, same pattern. Another. And again. The pattern repeated. Not constantly, but often enough to matter. Some individuals who had been helped were accounted for, their stories continued. But others stopped, abruptly, without explanation, without closure. And then, there were the entries written in Samuel Hartwell Sr.'s own hand. More personal, less structured, fragments of thought rather than records. One entry, dated in the summer of 1863, read, "The man calling himself James arrived 3 days ago. His account is consistent, but there is something in his manner that troubles me. He asks too much, about routes, about names. I have directed him elsewhere. It is not safe to bring him further into this operation." Another, from the following year, "The woman and her child departed yesterday. I have since received word that they were taken near the Maryland line. The child sold. The mother's fate unknown. I do not know if I did right in helping them, or if I sent them toward something worse." Vance read these entries aloud, quietly, without emphasis. But the words carried their own weight, because what they revealed was not a failure of effort, but a failure of certainty. This was not a clean story, not a simple narrative of right and wrong, of success and salvation. It was something else, something far more difficult to hold. "There are also records of payment," Vance said eventually. He turned a page, indicated a column. Amounts listed beside names. Not all, but enough. Thomas's gaze shifted slightly. Catherine turned from the window. "Payment?" she asked. Vance nodded. "It appears your husband's father was compensated at times for his work." The room grew still, not because the idea was shocking, but because of what it implied. Was it reimbursement? Support for the operation, or something else? A transaction attached to desperation. No one answered, because there was no answer that resolved it cleanly, and that was the truth of it. Samuel Hartwell Sr. had been a man who helped people escape slavery. That much was undeniable. But he had also been a man who made decisions in uncertainty, who judged, who chose, who sometimes sent people forward, and sometimes turned them away. And in those choices, lives were shaped, and sometimes lost. The room remained quiet for a long time after Vance finished speaking. Finally, Thomas asked the only question that seemed to matter. "What do you intend to do with this?" Vance closed the ledger carefully. "These documents are historically significant," he said. "They should be preserved, studied, understood." He paused. "But I recognize that they also carry personal consequence." That was an understatement. "These records will not remain hidden forever," Vance continued. "The question is whether they are revealed with care or discovered without context." Catherine spoke then, for the first time since the reading had begun. "My husband's father tried to help people," she said quietly. "Whatever else may be true, that must not be forgotten." Vance inclined his head slightly. "I agree. But the rest must not be hidden either," she added. There was no hesitation in her voice now, only resolve. "History does not become simpler because we wish it to be." Thomas looked at her longer than usual, then nodded. The decision, when it came, was not dramatic. It did not arrive with certainty, only acceptance. "The documents will be preserved," Thomas said. He looked at Vance. "You will take them. Ensure they are kept properly. But they are not to be made public while we are alive." Vance considered this, then nodded. "That is reasonable." And just like that, the secret changed form. It was no longer hidden, but it was not yet revealed. It had been placed into time, delayed, waiting, for a future that would judge it differently, perhaps more fairly, or perhaps not. But that, too, was part of the uncertainty, because some truths do not become easier with distance. They only become clearer. And clarity, as it turns out, can be its own kind of burden. After Edward Vance left the Hartwell farmhouse with the documents, the house itself seemed to settle back into something that resembled its former rhythm. But it was not the same. Not entirely. There are moments in a place, moments that do not alter its structure, its walls, or its routines, but change something less visible, something that lingers beneath the surface of daily life, shaping the way silence feels. The Hartwell house had become one of those places. The floorboards in the kitchen had been restored with careful precision. The wood matched, the seams aligned. To anyone entering the room without knowledge of what had occurred, there was nothing unusual to notice. But for those who knew, for those who had seen what lay beneath, the floor no longer felt like a surface. It felt like a covering. Thomas and Catherine did not speak of the documents again, not directly. There was no need. The knowledge existed between them now, settled into the quiet spaces of their shared life. Thomas returned to his routines. The farm demanded it. Livestock did not wait for reflection. Fields did not pause for memory. Work continued, as it always had, with the same steady discipline that had defined his life long before the discovery. And yet, there were changes, subtle but present. He spent more time in the evenings sitting at the kitchen table, his ledgers open but untouched. The careful records that had once filled his days seemed at times less urgent, as though numbers had lost some of their certainty, as though there were things that could not be accounted for. Catherine changed in a different way. If Thomas turned inward, she turned reflective. Her journal became her constant companion. She wrote more frequently now, her entries longer, more deliberate, filled with a kind of questioning that did not seek immediate answers. She wrote about the documents, not in detail, not in a way that would betray what had been entrusted to silence, but in feeling, in weight, in uncertainty. One entry, written in the spring of 1892, read, "I have been thinking about the names, the ones that appear clearly with destinations, with outcomes, and the others, the ones that end without conclusion. It is a strange thing to know that a person existed, that they passed through a place, that they were helped, and yet to have no knowledge of what became of them. It is as though they remain suspended somewhere between what was and what might have been." She wrote of Samuel Hartwell Sr., not as a figure of judgment, but as a man who had lived in a time that demanded decisions without certainty. "I do not believe he was cruel," she wrote in another entry, "but I do believe he was afraid, not for himself alone, but for the consequences of being wrong. And perhaps that is where the burden lies, not in the act of helping, but in the moments when help was given imperfectly." Her reflections did not seek to absolve, nor to condemn. They sought to understand. And understanding, she would come to realize, was not the same as resolution. Years passed. The rumors that had once circled the Hartwell property faded, replaced by newer stories, newer concerns. The community moved on, as communities always do, carrying fragments of the past without holding on to their full weight. In 1894, Thomas Hartwell died. His passing was not sudden. The stroke that had weakened him years earlier had left its mark, and over time his strength had diminished. When he died, it was described as peaceful, expected. He was 70 years old. Catherine was left alone in the house. For the first time, the responsibility for both the present and the past rested entirely with her. She did not leave. Many might have. The house, with its history, its silence, its hidden weight, could have been abandoned, sold, left behind as something belonging to another chapter. But Catherine remained. She continued to manage the property, though she relied more heavily now on others for the physical labor. A farm manager oversaw the day-to-day work, while she handled the decisions, the records, the structure of things. And she continued to write. Her journal became more than reflection. It became a kind of conversation, not with others, but with time itself. She wrote of truth, of secrecy, of the tension between them. "There is a comfort in silence," she wrote in 1893, "but it is not always a moral one. To keep something hidden is, in some cases, an act of protection. In others, it is an act of delay. And I cannot help but wonder which of those we have chosen." Visitors began to arrive, historians, researchers, people who had heard in fragments and rumors that something of significance had once been discovered at the Hartwell Farmhouse. They came with questions, with curiosity, with the careful language of those who sought information without offense. Catherine received some of them. She spoke with them, but she did not give them what they wanted. Not yet. "The documents are not mine to share," she would say. And that was the truth. The agreement made by Thomas remained. The past would wait. In 1903, Catherine Hartwell died. Her passing marked the end of the condition that had kept the documents sealed. What had been delayed was now ready to be revealed. In 1905, Margaret Ashton, one of the historians who had visited years earlier, took the necessary steps to have the documents released. Edward Vance, now an old man himself, confirmed the agreement. And so, in 1906, the documents were opened. For the first time, what had been hidden beneath the floorboards of the Hartwell Farmhouse became available to the world beyond it. Historians gathered, they read, they studied, they cross-referenced names, dates, locations, They searched for connections, for confirmations, for answers. And what they found was incomplete. The records were detailed, carefully kept, rich with information. But they did not resolve the central questions. Some of the individuals recorded in Samuel Hartwell Sr.'s documents could be traced, their paths followed, their outcomes known. They had reached the North or Canada. They had built lives, families, histories of their own. But others could not be found. No record of arrival, no mention in census data, no trace in letters or accounts. They simply disappeared. Historians offered explanations: capture, return to slavery, death along the journey, assimilation into communities where records were not kept or preserved. All plausible, all possible, but none confirmed. And so the mystery remained. Not dramatic, not sensational, but quiet, persistent. A question without answer. In the decades that followed, the Hartwell documents became an important resource for understanding the Underground Railroad in Pennsylvania. They were cited, studied, debated, but they never provided a complete picture, because history rarely does. In the 1970s, when the farmhouse itself was restored, workers uncovered something that added one final layer to the story. In the cellar, behind a loose stone, they found a letter, written in the same careful hand, dated 1868, 2 years after the war, addressed simply, "To whoever finds this." It was not long, but it was direct. Samuel Hartwell Sr. had written it as a kind of confession, not of crime, but of uncertainty. "I have done what I believed was right," he wrote, "but I have not always known if it was enough. There were those I helped, and there were those I could not, and there are those whose fates I do not know." He did not claim innocence nor guilt, only responsibility. "I have hidden these records not to deny them," he continued, "but to allow time to soften their judgment. I hope that those who find them will understand that I acted not with certainty, but with intention. And that intention, though imperfect, was all I had." It was perhaps the closest the story would ever come to an answer, and even then, it was not an answer at all. Because the truth of the Hartwell story is not found in resolution. It is found in its incompleteness, in the names that remain without endings, in the decisions made without certainty, in the space between what was done and what could not be known. Today, the Hartwell Farmhouse still stands. Visitors walk through its rooms. They see the kitchen, the floorboards, the place where the second layer once lay hidden. They read the documents, study the names, consider the choices. But the question remains. Not just what happened, but what it meant. Was Samuel Hartwell Sr. a hero? A man who risked everything to help others find freedom? Or was he something more complicated? A man who tried to do good and sometimes failed? The answer is not fixed. It changes depending on where you stand, what you value, what you believe matters most. And perhaps that is the point. History is not a story that resolves itself neatly. It is not a ledger that balances. It is a record of human choices made in moments where certainty is rare and consequences are not always visible. The Hartwell family chose to hide the truth and then to release it. Not because it was simple, but because it was necessary. And in doing so, they left behind something more than a mystery. They left behind a question. one that does not belong only to them, but to anyone willing to consider it. Should the truth always be revealed, even when it is incomplete, even when it carries discomfort? Or are there moments when silence serves a purpose, when the burden of knowing is not easily carried? There is no single answer, only perspective. And perhaps that is what lingers most. Not the documents, not the hidden space beneath the floorboards, but the understanding that some stories are not meant to be solved, only remembered and wondered about, long after the house grows quiet again.